Hello everyone, welcome to History Snob and welcome to part 1 of tier ranking every Roman emperor. First off, this is a part 1. This is going to be a series. I'm going to tier rank every Roman emperor eventually, but I don't want to do it so hastily that I'm just throwing off a couple generic lines about every emperor. I want to delve in a little bit more deeply into their reigns and into the events that were taking place while they were on the throne. And so I'm going to break this into parts so that we don't have a video that's about 12 years long. Today we are tier ranking the emperors starting with Augustus and going up to Domitian. So before beginning, I think it's a good idea to explain exactly how it is I'm going to be trying to assess the different emperors. It's obviously impossible to give someone a tier ranking objectively. People have lots of different views about these figures, but I'm going to try to focus, one, on their political acumen, that is, their ability to thrive within the political system, to reshape it to their ends, the ability of the emperor in question to actually get what they want done. Two, I'm going to assess their ability to survive in that system, by which I mean basically there are plenty of emperors who seemed like they were competent, who might have done a good job, but got themselves killed or, really did not survive long enough in the role to be impactful. And that just sort of kind of has to count against them. Thirdly, I'm obviously going to be looking at their positive or negative impacts, both within the span of their own lifetimes and also some of the long-term impacts of the things they did or didn't do. One thing I'm going to try hard not to consider is morality. And this is because, basically what the Roman Imperium boils down to is a military dictatorship. So it's sort of hard to be a morally righteous person when you're also a military dictator, in my view. And also, trying to impose the morality of the 21st century on people who lived 2,000 years ago is, in my view, completely pointless. These guys lived in a world where political violence was a reality. Having your enemies killed is just sort of a fact of life. It's what you have to do to stay in power, because if you don't, they are going to kill you. That's the moral landscape in which these men lived and operated. So in general, I'm not going to consider morality unless their behavior was so egregious, even by the standards of their own society, that it undermined their rule or legitimacy. But overall, I just want to say as a caveat before we start ranking emperors and rating them that obviously this is subjective. I'm trying to be as objective as possible, but, people have lots of different opinions, and my main hope is that this will provoke a conversation. So, let me know what you think about what I have to say about these emperors in the comments. Definitely interested to hear other people's perspectives on history. And finally, on the subject of objectivity or subjectivity, it's important to say right away that obviously our ancient sources, these people did not necessarily, all of them, live in the full light of history. A lot of the time, the sources we have are either completely biased or they're sources that have survived from later periods that were not contemporaneous with the emperors, who maybe cite other sources that didn't survive. But there's always a degree of question as to the legitimacy of the sources that we have about, people who lived 2,000 years ago. So I'm not going to shy away from, talking about some of the more sensationalist and frankly interesting stories about emperors that have passed down to us. But I will note when I think that the sources are somewhat dubious, or when I think that common sense conflicts with what the sources tell us. And it's certainly worth noting that that people who wrote the histories had their own biases, sometimes in favor of the emperors they were writing about and sometimes against them. So that's something to bear in mind. And also, us, thousands of years later, we're very interested in stories about sex and violence and aberrant behavior. These sensational aspects of biographies are always the ones that get focused upon, especially in the era of the internet, because they're the most interesting. People want to hear about them. We're going to talk about them, but I think it's important to bear in mind that that a lot of times, effectively, I think we end up parroting ancient propaganda because the propaganda is so salacious and it's a little bit easier than assessing what the actual truth is. Okay, with no further ado, let's get started with the emperors. We'll start, of course, with Augustus Caesar, née Octavian, who ruled the Roman world from 27 BC to AD 14. 40 years, thereabouts, he was in power. So Augustus, of course, was the grandnephew of Julius Caesar. Caesar, in his will, adopted Augustus as his heir, and so after the death of Caesar, Augustus was able to lay claim at least to part of Caesar's legacy. He ruled as a member of the Second Triumvirate alongside Mark Antony, who was Caesar's right-hand man, and also Marcus Lepidus, a random guy who happened to be in the right place at the right time with a couple legions, and so ended up sort of being taken into the partnership. The Second Triumvirate system quite quickly broke down. Mark Antony and Augustus were obviously the major players in the triumvirate. Lepidus was very quickly sidelined and was ultimately exiled, I think in 36 BC. And it came to war between Mark Antony and Augustus. Augustus defeated Antony at the Battle of Actium in 31 BC. After Antony and his ally/wife Cleopatra retreated to Egypt and committed suicide, Augustus, sort of as his first act as emperor, really annexed Egypt, and it would remain a province of the Roman Empire and later the Byzantine Empire until being conquered by the Caliphate in the 7th century. But interestingly, considering where the empire would go in the future, Augustus's genius was not really as a military leader, although he, of course, won significant battles, or significant battles were won under his aegis. Augustus's actual skill was as a politician. Most of his victories were won by generals under his command, such as his friend and lieutenant Marcus Agrippa or his stepson Tiberius. Augustus was a statesman. He was careful to maintain the form of the old republic. He was careful to respect the Senate, or be seen to respect the Senate and the magistracies and the various offices that had existed under the old republic and that had once wielded real power. These institutions of quote-unquote democracy, a democracy of wealthy oligarchs. But in effect, Augustus, of course, centralized all meaningful authority in himself. He took the title Princeps Civitatis, or First Citizen, and that's kind of a good encapsulation of his whole sort of style of leadership, where everyone knew that Augustus was the man, and everyone tolerated it on the condition that he, maintained the pretense that the Senate and that the forms of the old republic were still really in charge. That being said, Augustus's achievements as first citizen were enormous. He conquered much of the modern-day Balkans and Central Europe, as well as he completed the Roman conquest of Spain. And, of course, as mentioned, he annexed Egypt. He did also suffer a catastrophic defeat, or rather his legions suffered a catastrophic defeat at the Battle of the Teutoburg Forest, when the Germanic leader Arminius pretty much wiped out 3 legions. Augustus was also an accomplished diplomat, and as mentioned, he was a statesman. He negotiated peace with Parthia in the east. He also created the postal system, which would prove invaluable to the empire and particularly to later emperors, allowing them to send and receive information faster than anyone else. Augustus also created the Praetorian Guard, the a military unit, but not really on the same level as a legion, but a brigade that would be responsible for safeguarding the emperors, and of course would later go on to murder many emperors. And Augustus was also a road builder and just a builder in general. I'm obviously painting a very positive picture here of Augustus as, this is kind of a George Washington situation where it's sort of hard to, the role was created for and by him. He defined it, and so it's sort of hard to give him anything other than a 5-star rating here. But if there is one major failure of Augustus's reign and the polity that he created, the Roman Empire, it is that he created a political system that no one else was really equipped to inherit from him. He had unique political abilities that many of his successors did not have, and they would struggle to operate within this system. And ultimately, this early Roman Empire, the Principate as it is often called, would devolve into just being a military dictatorship because it is easier to rule through brute force than it is to rule like Augustus. And Augustus also had a sort of unique legitimacy emerging out of the Second Triumvirate, and as the heir of Julius Caesar, his influence and his power was unchallenged, and that would not be the case for many of his successors. So in a way, his unique role in history led him to create a position, the emperor, that was very difficult for anyone else to fill, and would lead to a number of successors failing quite spectacularly and quite fast. That being said, there is absolutely no other rank I can give Augustus other than A+. We now move on to the second emperor, Tiberius, who ruled from AD 14 to AD 37. Tiberius was Augustus's stepson, and he sort of ended up becoming Augustus's successor by default because Augustus's grandkids had died. A lot of other people who could have taken the job were just dead by the time Augustus kicked it. So the job fell to Tiberius. Tiberius is sort of an odd character. He's a little bit of a contradiction. On the one hand, he seemed extremely reluctant to rule. He doesn't seem like someone who really wanted to be emperor. But on the other hand, over the course of his reign, it seems like he becomes increasingly paranoid and controlling. He's sort of like a hands-off micromanager, or someone who wants to control every aspect of what's going on, but also just doesn't want to do any work. A lazy dictator, I guess. So upon coming to power, Tiberius tried to emulate Augustus by refusing numerous honors that were offered to him by the Senate. However, his attempts to come across as humble were actually interpreted as insults by many of the senators. In general, Tiberius did not get along with the Senate, and he had a low opinion of senators, according to Tacitus. Tiberius said that the senators would be better off as slaves. But at the same time, it seems like he really wanted to delegate a lot of decision-making to the Senate. And he kind of wanted them to just sort of operate without his guidance. He wanted them to do what he wanted them to do, but he didn't want to have to make them do it or really be involved. And so it seems like a lot of people were often confused about exactly what it was Tiberius wanted. And his orders tended to provoke debate rather than, people just obeying, because people were never quite sure what the hell it was that he was trying to tell them. That being said, Tiberius was not incompetent. He had proved that he was a skilled general and diplomat serving under Augustus. It was more like he just didn't really care for having the full mantle of power himself. The real turning points in Tiberius's reign were the deaths of his nephew Germanicus, whom he had adopted, and his biological son Drusus. After that, Tiberius largely retreated from public life. In AD 26, he left Rome for his palace on the island of Capri, leaving behind the Praetorian prefect Sejanus, who basically became prime minister or, vice emperor at this point. Tiberius just kind of went on a permanent holiday and left this guy Sejanus to rule in his stead. And this is the first point in Roman history where the Praetorian Guards really emerge as this disproportionately powerful force in politics, because they controlled, among other things, First of all, they control the emperor's security. So, the people who are responsible for safeguarding your life and or could kill you if they felt like it, obviously have an innate power. But they also control the post and communications. They control access to the emperor. So with Tiberius sort of on permanent holiday on Capri, the Praetorian Guard controls what information reaches him. Also, we should say, again, with the sources, it's hard to say how true this is, but the word on the street historically is that Tiberius was that his island retreat of Capri was sort of like an Epstein Island of sorts. I don't want to go into details about the allegations about what Tiberius was doing in his retirement palace, because I'll get demonetized, etc., etc. But if you know, the allegations about his personal conduct, not great. Anyway, in Tiberius's absence from Rome, Sejanus goes totally drunk with power and basically has a reign of terror. He starts purging and executing senators and other prominent people who could threaten him, and basically turns himself into a dictator. Eventually, somewhat belatedly, Tiberius realized that Sejanus was totally out of control, and he wrote a letter to the Senate condemning him and ordering his execution, along with all of his associates. But the damage had been done, and at this point, following the removal of Sejanus, Tiberius just totally withdraws from really being emperor at all, except for being increasingly paranoid and being convinced that a bunch of people are coming to take away this job that he doesn't want and isn't doing. He basically spent the last years of his life completely isolated. When he died, he was not deified. The opinion of him was pretty low upon his death. I'm going to say that Tiberius gets a D. It's not that he was inept or anything. When he put his mind to being emperor, he wasn't bad at it. It's just that he had no mind to be emperor. He seems like he was someone who was kind of a depressed alcoholic. He was melancholy. He didn't want to do the job. And so he just refused to do the job. And so, I think a D's, if anything, pretty generous. Okay, now we come to Caligula. There really are some very colorful characters in this first episode amongst the early emperors. So Caligula is the grandnephew of Tiberius. Tiberius's will stipulated that Caligula and his cousin Gemellus were to be joint heirs. However, Gemellus was a teenager. He was considerably younger than Caligula. Caligula was in his mid-20s by this point. Caligula had also made friends with the new Praetorian prefect who had replaced Sejanus, a guy called Macro. And Macro really sort of cultivated Caligula. Caligula was living at the court of Tiberius throughout his youth. Tiberius, as noted, was gloomy and paranoid. Many members of Caligula's family had been killed under Sejanus. Caligula sort of grew up in this as a sort of noble prisoner at his great uncle's Epstein Island. So his early life was extremely precarious. Macro had befriended him, had sort of given favorable reports to Tiberius about Caligula, who, if Caligula had seemed threatening in any way to Tiberius, Tiberius probably would have had him killed. Macro really helped Caligula into power and made sure that Caligula survived the paranoid descent into madness that defined the later years of Tiberius's reign. So, because through Macro's assistance and also through the support of the Senate, Caligula was proclaimed emperor within a few days of Tiberius dying. Also, Tiberius's will was invalidated so that Caligula didn't have to share his inheritance with his cousin Gemellus. So, although little was known about Caligula, he was the son of Germanicus, who was a popular military hero. So he was warmly welcomed by the people of Rome. Caligula, of course, was not the name that he went by. His real name was Gaius. Caligula means little boot. It was a name that was given to him by his father's troops while he was on campaign, presumably dressed up as like a little soldier. And it's the name that has stuck for all of history. I'm sure he would not have enjoyed being called Little Boot. So for the first 7 or 8 months of Caligula's reign, he was enormously popular. There was a lot of hope that this new, young, dynamic son of a much-loved war hero would be a good ruler and an improvement over the grim, somber, pederast Tiberius. Caligula gave out large, lavish cash gifts to the Praetorian Guards, to all kinds of soldiers, and indeed to all citizens. He undertook a large number of construction projects, aqueducts, racetracks, amphitheaters. Basically, he was sort of setting himself up as a man of the people, a dynamic new ruler. Now, Tiberius had kept a sort of cache of secret documents that were allegedly full of evidence that various prominent people had committed treason. He was a paranoid type. Caligula made a show of publicly burning all of these papers to sort of signify to the Senate and to other prominent people that, hey, the days of this sort of paranoid, endless purge after purge, that's all over. He burned them publicly to send that message, and claimed that he had not even read them. This was all a lie, but we'll come back to that a little later. So the turning point in Caligula's reign was a mysterious illness. In the fall of 37 AD, Caligula became seriously sick and nearly died. We don't know what the illness was, unfortunately. But after this sort of brush with death, Caligula started to show a lot more of a dark side. So after he takes ill and then recovers, he starts forcing senators he doesn't like to commit suicide. He forces his cousin Gemellus, who again could have posed a threat, even though he's still just a teenager. He forces Gemellus to commit suicide. One story that's particularly gruesome is that he gave Gemellus a sword and told him to fall on it, basically, and a soldier had to do it for him because he couldn't figure out how to take his own life. Pretty brutal. And indeed, Caligula even forced Macro, his ally, without whom he would not have been able to come to power. He forced Macro to commit suicide as well. So the theory I subscribe to, and I'm not the only one, is that while Caligula was on his deathbed, he noticed that all of the powerful people around him started maneuvering and plotting for a new regime that would take shape after his death. And this activated sort of undercurrent of paranoia that was latent in him from the time, growing up at the court of Tiberius, constantly being in danger, having this really, really precarious upbringing where, he legitimately had to fear for his life. And so Caligula, I think, started to see threats everywhere around him from this point forward. He had like a sort of Ivan the Terrible childhood. I think that's a good comparison. So in AD 39, Caligula really came into significant conflict with the Senate. He revealed that he had not actually burned Tiberius's treason trove, and he inaugurated a series of trials against supposedly disloyal senators. However, despite the image that we have of Caligula, it doesn't seem that he murdered senators that much. It was kind of more that he just really hated and distrusted them, and he liked humiliating them. He wanted to extort them, strip them of titles, seize their properties, and so on. Although, of course, he did kill some of them. It also seems that Caligula spent very lavishly on games, gifts to friends and allies. He was a big fan. He liked actors and people who were considered disreputable performers. A lot of these people had been exiled by Tiberius. Caligula brought them all back and gave them gifts. He liked to hang out with these kinds of people. He liked to show. He liked a good time. And he liked to spend lavishly on these things. He also liked to build, and he taxed heavily to pay for all of this, on top of allegedly I say allegedly like he might sue me for libel. Well, allegedly, extorting and seizing under false pretenses property from the rich. Although he also was not above plundering his own people. He turned up in Gaul and sort of sacked parts of Gaul and, collected plunder, supposedly. He also demanded to be worshipped as a living god in a way that was thought to be immodest. Roman emperors were deified, but typically after they died, and typically only, good emperors or emperors who were in good with the Senate would be deified. As I had alluded to in the opening, there's kind of no point rehashing the accusations against Caligula, like, the claim that he wanted to make his horse Incitatus a consul. This was probably a joke that, his horse would make a better consul than Senator X. Or that he waged war with Neptune and made his legionaries, collect seashells for him as tribute from the god of the sea. Or that he had an inappropriate relationship with his sister. I mean, these things are either just like completely debunked or probably untrue. Caligula is one of the most maligned figures in history. It's clear that he was, extremely unpopular with the people who write histories, the equestrians and the senators, the rich and the influential. And so he was ultimately assassinated in AD 41 by a faction of his own guards. It's kind of unclear. Well, everything's unclear. This was 2,000 years ago, but it's kind of unclear if it was a broader conspiracy. But it seems probable that there were powerful political people who were putting the guards up to getting rid of Caligula. I do not subscribe to the theory that Caligula was really mad. I think that he was someone who had a very, very, who grew up in terror. And then when handed absolute power and having a near-death experience, I think that it brought out paranoid tendency in him, which I think was also combined with an element of like sadism and nastiness and a lack of any sense that you need to accommodate other people, even if you are emperor, and that you can't just do whatever you want. But his real crime, I think, historically, in terms of why he is so maligned, is that he hated the Senate and the Senate hated him. And that is going to definitely be a recurring theme in this series, among emperors who get a bad press from sources. So Caligula is an F pretty easily, which brings us to Claudius, who reigned from AD 41 to 54. So there's some suggestion that some of the people who probably were involved in killing Caligula wanted to restore the Republic. Whether or not that's the case, the Praetorian Guard had other plans. Much of Caligula's family was killed in the ensuing chaos after his assassination, but one who was spared, the last living male member of the family, was his uncle, Claudius, who, according to tradition, was found in the palace cowering behind a curtain by members of the Praetorian Guard, who, upon discovering him, instead of killing him, decided to proclaim him emperor. So really, Claudius is proclaimed emperor by the Praetorian Guards and not by the Senate, although the Senate does go along with it. And that will have consequences for Claudius, as we'll see. So Claudius himself is an interesting figure. He had some kind of physical disability. It's not exactly clear what it was, and it's described differently in different places. It seems as though he walked with a limp. He may have been hard of hearing. He might have stuttered. It seems he had some sort of childhood illness that resulted in a lifelong disability. This is also made more confusing by the fact that Claudius himself later claimed that he had exaggerated the symptoms of his disability early in life in order to stay alive, because it would cause people to underestimate him and not see him as a threat. It's worth pointing out that people with physical disabilities or deformities were not looked on kindly in the Roman world or in most ancient societies. In order to be a ruler or to be somebody who has a degree of public profile, you cannot have any, like, certain physical disabilities are just disqualifying. They're seen as like physical manifestations of character or a sign that you are not fit to exist in public life. But yeah, people in the ancient world were very, very susceptible to the idea that if you look good, that means you are good. And if you have some kind of disability or something that they deem to be wrong with your appearance, that's a sign that there's something wrong with you, with your character, with your abilities, etc. So Claudius was largely kept out of sight by his family as a result of whatever physical deformities he had. Although also part of the reason why he was kept out of the limelight is because he was a historian, and he wrote a number of histories, which apparently were a little bit too honest for the liking of his family. So Claudius lived a largely private life until Caligula spontaneously made him consul in 37. Although his relationship with Caligula was not good, and Caligula apparently teased and tormented him, and demanded large sums of money from him, etc., etc. Not a great uncle-nephew relationship. So in AD 41, Claudius is brought to power by the Praetorians, and the fact that he was not acclaimed by the Senate, but was rather acclaimed by the soldiery, and the fact that some in the Senate apparently had wanted to go back to a republic, caused some immediate rifts between Claudius and the Senate. This would be a feature of his reign, is that although the Claudius had a contentious relationship with the Senate, in general, Claudius was conscientious, judicious. He tried to be fair, but he was also, I would say, sensitive to slights, and had a quick temper. He was always perceived as vulnerable by potential rivals around him, so he faced many plots. And so this sort of forced him into an antagonistic relationship with the Senate and with the upper echelons of society, because he was constantly having to unearth plots and have people put to death for scheming against him. Claudius's most famous achievement was the conquest of Britain, which he began in AD 43. Conquering something for a Roman emperor, it's an easy way early in your reign to show strength and ability, and to confer legitimacy, all of which Claudius desperately needed. So Britain, the Romans had some contact with Britain. Julius Caesar had landed there. They'd landed there a couple times. They'd never made a serious attempt to conquer the island, however. And it was seen as sort of like a potentially lucrative asset for the empire, but also kind of a strange and mysterious land. So conquering Britain was a big boon for Claudius's legitimacy. He was granted a triumph for this, although he personally was only in Britain for like 2 weeks. Apparently he did bring elephants with him, however. In terms of domestic affairs, Claudius was primarily interested in building roads and aqueducts. He was also very interested in law. He was a learned man, and he presided over a lot of cases himself. He liked to sit in judgment. Claudius also reformed the civil service and professionalized it. He began the practice of allowing freedmen, that is, former slaves, particularly freedmen who were members of the emperor's household, to serve, and sort of started the process of building like a professional bureaucracy that could actually govern and could take on more of a workload. Claudius was friendly to common people. He was somewhat less pretentious than many other emperors. He was comfortable, with freedmen. Probably he was an unpretentious person because he'd kind of been shut away and cloistered for much of his life, and probably a lot of his interactions were with people who were, from lower castes and orders than himself. However, unfortunately, Claudius's personal life was, to say the least, troubled. He was often said to be dominated by his wives, particularly his third wife, Messalina. So Messalina infamously married a man she was having an affair with while Claudius was away. This was possibly part of a plot for the two of them to wed and then overthrow Claudius. As a result of this, he had to execute his own wife, and after this, his life really kind of went downhill. There were, a lot of other people, prominent people who were involved, who had been present, who had been, party to this. As noted, Claudius always had to respond violently to threats to his reign because he was seen as weak. So after executing Messalina, Claudius ends up marrying his niece Agrippina. Marrying your niece, incidentally, under Roman law is considered incestuous, so this was not something that was considered normal or advisable or a good idea. But it was a good idea politically because it was an attempt to consolidate family power. The two of them were related, but Agrippina had some legitimacy that Claudius lacked in terms of lineage. I forget the details, but basically this was a political marriage to his own niece. And unfortunately, Agrippina brought into the marriage a son from previous marriage, Nero, and Agrippina was a master schemer, really truly a master of the dark arts of politics, and she immediately began scheming and manipulating Claudius and really sort of placing Nero in a position to succeed Claudius, in preference to Claudius's own biological son, Britannicus, who was, 6 or 7 years younger than Nero, something like that. And so Agrippina came to seize more and more power over the final years of Claudius's reign. And many people over the last, call it 1950 years, have suspected that she murdered Claudius and poisoned him in AD 54 in order to ensure the succession of her son Nero. There are people who dispute this. Of course, it's impossible to say what really happened, but, many people are saying that Agrippina the Younger murdered Claudius. At any rate, I'm going to give Claudius a B-. I think that, for someone who had he's an accidental emperor in the first place, not someone who ever in his wildest dreams could have imagined that he would be in the position that he ended up in. He has a lot going against him just, because of his whatever physical ailments he had and the prejudices that people faced in the ancient world as a result of that. And, the fact that he was just perceived as weak meant that he, constantly faced challenges from potential rivals, but he managed to survive. He does have some real accomplishments. He ultimately kind of lost control of his own reign and was sort of dominated by his niece wife, Agrippina. At the end, he sort of lost it, and the results, as we'll see, are, there were some consequences for that, and it doesn't reflect necessarily well on his character. But in general, I think, considering the circumstances in which he came to power, he did surprisingly well. So now we come to the big boy, Nero, who reigned from AD 54 to 68. So, as I mentioned, Nero came to power because his mother, Agrippina the Younger, married Claudius, and Claudius did adopt him. Nero, as mentioned, was older than Britannicus, so he and his mother were pretty easily able to seize power when Claudius died, and or when they murdered him. Your mileage may vary. Britannicus, at this point, was like 10, maybe too young to reign, and so not really a threat, but not yet. So Nero took power at the age of 16. And from the beginning, he was pretty much controlled by his mother, Agrippina, who had a network of supporters that she had built up over the years. Agrippina was a very, very politically skilled woman and a great example of how women were able to wield power in ancient Rome, even despite the fact that they did not enjoy, obviously, full equality with men in a political or social sense. Agrippina stacked Nero's administration with her appointees. Upon taking power, Nero promised that he would restore the relationship between the emperor and the Senate, which had deteriorated under Claudius. So Agrippina and her officials completely dominated the early stage of Nero's reign. Agrippina set about murdering her rivals. She issued coins with her face on them, something usually only emperors did. She attended sittings of the Senate, although she had to sort of hide behind a curtain, even though women were not allowed in the Senate chamber. That was a first. And she even attempted to receive and treat with ambassadors on her son's behalf, and had to be stopped from doing that. Obviously, Nero resented this. No teenage boy, certainly not one who's in charge of the entire world, wants to allow his mother to make all his decisions for him. Nero was having an affair with a freed woman, a former slave, and his mother was extremely angry about this. She scolded him over it, told him he wasn't allowed, etc., etc. We're going to find a nice wife for you, one that I pick. And then she threatened that if Nero didn't do as she said, she would back Britannicus. She would replace her biological son with her son by marriage. As a result of which Nero had Britannicus poisoned. Ultimately, Nero decided that he needed to rid himself of his mother as well. The story that is traditionally given, and this is one of those sensationalist stories that I warned against, but we're going to tell it because it's pretty, it involves the murder of an elderly woman, but it is pretty funny. So, supposedly Nero, to dispose of his mother, had a special ship built that was supposed to fall apart once it was out to sea, and he somehow induced his mother to get on this ship. And she did, and the ship fell apart, broke apart, and sank. But dang it all, the old beg survived and swam back to shore, whereupon Nero had one of his freedmen just stab her to death out of frustration. I mean, that story is too bizarre to be true, or maybe it's too bizarre to be a lie. I don't know. But in any event, Nero certainly had his mother killed. And maybe we should just debunk some of the myths about Nero before we get into discussing what he did do. One of Nero's other great crimes of which he's been accused is the murder of his second wife, Poppaea, that he beat her to death while she was pregnant. This story is obviously untrue. Who witnessed it? Made up. It's possible that he did kill his wife, but he was certainly, he was desperately in love with her. He reportedly burned a year's worth of incense at her funeral, and shortly thereafter he castrated and married a slave boy who was said to resemble her, a guy named Sporus. So the other infamous crime for which of which Nero has been convicted by posterity is the fire of Rome. Many people say that he started it. Even some of the ancient sources who are pretty unanimously anti-Nero don't substantiate this. He was not in Rome when the fire started. By all accounts, he rushed back to the city. He led efforts to fight the fire. He provided food and housing. He let people who had lost their homes stay in his palaces and gave them food and room and board basically free of charge. He rebuilt their houses. He did seize some land in order to build for himself an enormous and completely unnecessary palace called the Domus Aurea, the Golden House. But he seems to have taken the land to do that from rich people, because the rich people lived up on the hills of Rome, and that's where he wanted to build. The homes of the common people he rebuilt, and by all accounts rebuilt them better. He also improved building codes in the notoriously awful slums of the city of Rome to try and prevent future fires and make sure that the buildings that he rebuilt at his own expense would be less apt to burn down in the future. All of this, his rebuilding of Rome, including building this gigantic vibrating golden palace for himself, required Nero to raise taxes. In general, Nero liked to spend money. Even before this, he had been spending quite a lot. But this necessity of raising more taxes was actually the real cause of his supposed unpopularity and ultimately his downfall. It was not, cruelty or any of this other. It was the spending and the taxing. So, in general, Nero was, I would describe him as a cultural emperor. That was his vision of himself, as someone who was improving the cultural life of the Roman people. So during his reign, the Roman army did put down the revolt of Boudica in Britain. They won a victory in the east against the Parthians. But Nero's personal interest was in building colosseums, baths, markets, and other amenities for the common people. He wanted to give them shows and spectacles. He performed himself, as is widely known. This disgusted elites, but ordinary people liked Nero, as we'll see after his death. Basically, Nero's real crime in the eyes of the rich the people who write the histories, is that he wanted to tax them to build baths for peasants. That's why they hated him. And a lot of the other stuff about Nero, frankly, being, the worst tyrant that ever lived, etc., is probably just a bunch of made-up BS. At any rate, Nero faced a revolt in AD 68 from the governor Gaius Julius Vindex. And although this revolt was put down and Vindex committed suicide, another governor in Spain, Galba, had already risen up. And so Nero was declared a public enemy by the Senate, and he either killed himself or had one of his freedmen do it for him, depending on which version of events you believe. Here's a hot take. I actually don't consider Nero to be one of the worst emperors. I have a much more favorable view of Nero than probably anyone else. I will give Nero a C. I will say that Nero's primary flaw, as I alluded to, was the fact that he was so hated by the elites. He was, I think, partly hated for the way that he disposed of his mother, who was a very powerful woman who had a lot of allies who would continue to cause problems for Nero later into his reign. He was also a spendthrift, and he didn't give a lot of thought for the Moro. I mean, obviously, he wanted to build a giant golden palace for himself, but I think basically the reason why Nero has been denigrated for millennia is because he angered a lot of rich people by raising their taxes in order to build colosseums and baths and marketplaces. He may not have been a wise ruler, but I don't think he was a disastrous ruler. And there is actually kind of the coherent, you can see what Nero wanted to be. And I wouldn't even really say that he failed. I mean, when you think about it, in the grand scheme of things, to be emperor for 14 years, although Nero was, young when he died, as these things go, that's not terrible. And as we'll see, Nero was actually only unpopular with the rich. He was extremely popular with common people, especially in the eastern part of the empire. And we'll see that two of the next three emperors will attempt to emulate Nero as much as possible. And there will be for quite a long time a myth that Nero never died, and that he will one day return to lead the Romans. And this myth will particularly persist in the East. And they don't say stuff about like that about you if you're unpopular. So I think Nero is, most of the bad things about Nero are actually just ancient propaganda. Okay, now let's move on to a genuinely terrible emperor, Galba, who is emperor from June of AD 68 to January of AD 69. So, as previously mentioned, Galba had been part of the uprising at the end of Nero's reign and ended up being declared emperor by the Senate after the death of Vindex. Galba was an elderly, respected guy who had held a bunch of jobs. He was already in, his late 70s, 80s. He was old. He was an old guy by the time he became emperor. Somebody who was considered a safe pair of hands by everyone. Everybody respected him. Everybody knew him. He was not controversial. Let's just have an emperor who can make Rome normal again. Galba had been serving as governor in Spain when he became emperor, so he had to march toward Rome. According to sources, which again we take with a grain of salt, during his march toward Rome, Galba behaved incredibly poorly. He was extremely angry when he passed through towns where he felt like people had been too slow to side with him, to declare him emperor. Apparently, he, taxed these people or sort of looted them. In some cases, he may have strung up people who he felt had been too slow to declare him emperor. Extremely bad form, also very stupid. There's one story that's probably apocryphal that one town, the citizens presented Galba with a crown of gold, which they said was 15 pounds, and Galba weighed it and found that it was 2 pounds light of gold, and so he forced the city to give him the 2 pounds of gold that they had apparently withheld from him. Whether or not these things are true, this is an indication of how people felt about Galba, that he was spiteful, petty, and cheap. And as he advanced toward Rome, this reputation that that this guy was coming, who was kind of a hard ass, who nobody liked, and who was this elderly miser, that kind of reputation went before him. It seems as though Galba's supporters in Rome had promised, donatives to people, donatives for the Romans. This is money that you get, usually soldiers, but sometimes also people who are politically important or just citizens, money that you get when there's a new emperor. It seems that people who were representing Galba in Rome had made promises on his behalf. When Galba arrived, he refused to pay, which was very unwise. And so there were many stories that circulated about Galba's legendary cheapness, and that he is seen to be frugal and not generous, which is a very, very bad reputation to have in Roman politics, especially if you're an emperor and your continued existence relies on paying, the Praetorian Guard and others around you who are hold your life in their hands. The other problem with Galba, as mentioned, is that he was very old, and so he was seen as being dominated by younger favorites and advisors. These guys went around confiscating property from people, property that had been given to them by Nero, or that they had supposedly gotten by ill-gotten gains, and then auctioning it off to themselves for pennies on the dollar. They were, basically using the law or some perversion of law to seize people's property for themselves. This was massively unpopular. Also, there were a group of there were rowers who were they rowed the ships in the Roman Navy. Not a desirable job. Nero had allowed them to become soldiers, that he had promoted them. Supposedly when Galba took over, he demanded that they go back to the ships, that they, he said that you were not going to be soldiers, you're going to be rowers again, I'm demoting you. When they protested, supposedly Galba decimated them. The ancient practice of having the men draw straws, groups of 10 men draw straws, and then whoever draws the short straw, the other 9 men beat him to death. This was an old Roman practice, but of course by this time it's considered to be barbaric, completely insane. It's unclear whether Galba really did this or not. Again, we take the sources with a grain of salt, but it is clear that Galba was viewed as arbitrary, cruel, not interested in justice, and sort of looking to be a hard ass and to sort of roll back these perceived excesses of Nero's reign, even if some of those excesses were really just excesses of generosity or kindness. Galba had done everything possible to make himself detested by everyone. The last mistake he made was adopting this guy called Piso as his heir. At this point, a guy called Otho, who we'll talk about in a couple seconds here, organized a conspiracy against him. He was angry that he had not been adopted. He was also, like everyone else, probably just completely dismayed at how awful Galba had turned out to be. And so he talked the soldiers whose donatives had not been paid by Galba into killing Galba and proclaiming him emperor instead. The historian Tacitus famously said of Galba, quote, "He seemed too great to be a subject so long as he was subject, and all would have agreed that he was equal to the imperial office if he had never held it." And I think that basically sums up Galba. I have a completely negative view of Galba. I actually think he's arguably one of the worst of all Roman emperors. I give him I know it's not a real grade, but I'm giving him an F-. All Galba really had to do was be normal, sober, show probity and decency, and not piss anyone off. Just be a safe pair of hands for a couple years until and pick a younger, prominent person to be your heir to succeed you, and everything would have gone fine. And he failed in that in every way possible by allowing his administration to become corrupt, doing everything in his power to infuriate everybody he met. Total failure, one of the worst. Okay, so we now come to Otho, who served as Roman emperor from January to April in AD 69. Despite the extreme brevity of his reign, Otho is actually kind of an interesting guy. So Otho had been like a swinger buddy of Nero's. Otho had also been sleeping with Poppaea, who was the second wife of Nero, whom he has been accused of murdering. Indeed, Otho was married to Poppaea, but Nero was also sleeping with her, and Nero was obsessed with her. So ultimately, he kind of forced Otho to divorce Poppaea so that he could marry her, and then he sent Otho to serve as governor of the remote province of Lusitania in northern Spain. So Otho, from that point on, Otho was not really so hot on Nero. It seems like he realized maybe Nero's not so cool after stealing his wife. So Otho was in Spain when Nero ends up facing revolt, and Otho takes up with Galba and comes to Rome with Galba as one of Galba's supporters, one of his chief supporters, in fact. And then, of course, as has been told, he turned on Galba. So when Otho took power, despite the fact that he'd had a falling out with Nero, he restored Nero's statues, restored many of the officials who had served Nero, and the sort of common people took to calling him Nero Otho. He even actually took Sporus, the eunuch who apparently resembled Poppaea, who Nero had married. Otho took him into his bed as well. So yeah, some evidence here that, as I said, that actually Nero was pretty popular, and Galba had been kind of the anti-Nero, and Otho's whole thing was, I'm just like Nero. You should like me because I'm like Nero. However, Otho really kind of only had one problem that he got to deal with, and that problem was a guy called Vitellius. So basically, when Otho took over, he started reading through Galba's correspondence, getting himself caught up on, what's on the emperor's plate. And he realized that, most of Germany is in revolt now. The German provinces and the legions are in revolt. They have declared Vitellius, a guy called Vitellius, who was their commander, they've declared him emperor. And so Vitellius was marching south to claim the throne for himself. So Otho diplomatically tried to offer to share power with Vitellius, but of course Vitellius was in a good position here and did not accept, was not interested in that. So Otho gathered what forces he could, and apparently he had a pretty sizable army at his back, not necessarily much compared to the very powerful German legions, and the legions of Gaul had also declared for Vitellius as well, but Otho had maybe 40,000 men, something like that, and a pretty good navy. So he marched north, and his troops went into battle against Vitellius at Bedriacum, the Battle of Bedriacum. And his army was defeated. Now, Otho's army was defeated, but it was not routed and it was not destroyed. He still had a good number of troops at his command, and there were other legions in the Balkans who were, on their way to Italy to fight for him, who were loyal to him. However, Otho decided that he should accept his partial defeat as sort of the verdict of history. And so he decided to endorse Vitellius, urge his supporters to go over to Vitellius, and then he killed himself in the hopes of preventing a civil war that would kill thousands of people. And the quote that is attributed to him, to Otho, is, better that one should die to save all than that all should die to save one. So something that's commonly noted about Otho is that he's a rare example in history of someone who actually kind of becomes more morally pure while wielding power. He, a lot of people sort of expected that Otho would be just like Nero in terms of being like, the parts of Nero that are undesirable, that he was, decadent and selfish. And instead, Otho kind of made a rather noble sacrifice in an attempt to prevent a war and sort of put his own people ahead of himself. So in light of that, I will give him a D-, and I'm being kind because really he deserves an F. I appreciate the moral quality of sacrificing yourself, but really it doesn't say much for you when the highlight of your reign is your suicide. So a D- for Otho, although it is kind of a sad story. Okay, we now come to Vitellius, who is emperor from April to December 69 AD. So Galba had put Vitellius in charge of the German legions, likely because Vitellius was seen as being kind of a fat, dumb, lazy person, and therefore that he would be no threat. Supposedly, Vitellius was able to become very popular quite quickly with the troops under his command because he refused to discipline them and pretty much just let them do whatever they wanted, which is a quick way to gain popularity with soldiers, but also an extremely dangerous way to gain popularity, as we will see. So at the beginning of AD 69, the troops under Vitellius's command were called upon to renew an oath of loyalty and swear an oath of loyalty to Galba. And they refused to do this. Instead, they proclaimed Vitellius emperor and refused to acknowledge Galba any further. Now, in reality, the people who were really sort of the power behind Vitellius were two commanders who served under him, Caecina and Fabius Valens. So Vitellius and his legions marched south. At some point, they figured out that Galba was dead and that they were now marching against Otho, but that didn't really matter. Generally, once you proclaim yourself emperor, you kind of have to follow through with it. At that point, you're either going to become emperor or you're going to die in the attempt. So Vitellius's forces defeated Otho at the First Battle of Bedriacum. And Vitellius marched into Rome with his victorious and completely undisciplined army of louts. Supposedly as a result of this, there was unspeakable loot and pillage, and the city was sort of turned into a riot, an orgy of violence and theft, and again, the consequences of having an undisciplined army and a commander who openly is just like, yeah, go crazy, do whatever. Vitellius was seemingly uninterested in the work that was required to be emperor and was basically allowed Caecina and Fabius to do most of the work while he sort of partied and feasted. Supposedly, Vitellius killed his mother because of a prophecy that he would live longer if she was dead. He also apparently had a kind of unofficial war against astrologers and killed a bunch of astrologers. So, important business of state. Now, generally, Vitellius is depicted as being extremely gluttonous and morbidly obese. Edward Gibbon claims that in his 8-month reign, he consumed $6 million worth of food. How anyone could possibly know that is unclear to me. There are all sorts of descriptions of lavish feasts that basically the portrait that were painted from the sources, which again we should take with a grain of salt, is that Vitellius was mostly interested in feasting, interested in the trappings of being emperor, but not really interested in ruling at all. What is clear is that Vitellius did not inspire much loyalty, and that some of the rats pretty quickly were looking for a way off the sinking ship. So in July of AD 69, Vitellius learned that all the provinces of the east had proclaimed the general Vespasian emperor. Vitellius sent Caecina to deal with the problem, and instead Caecina defected. Subsequently, Vitellius's troops were defeated by Vespasians at Bedriacum on almost the exact same spot where he had defeated Otho just a few months earlier. And at this point, it was pretty clear that Vitellius's cause was doomed. Now, this is where he really, really disgraces himself, and in my view, puts himself in the category or in contention for the absolute worst emperor. So, realizing that he was not going to be able to retain his throne, Vitellius entered into secret negotiations with representatives of Vespasian in an attempt to save himself. Basically, he offered to abdicate in exchange for his life being spared. It's important to point out that at this point in Roman history, and actually generally in Roman history, there are no retired emperors. Diocletian retired, but very few others. Generally, if you want to resign being emperor, you do what Otho did, and you take your own life. That's what's considered to be the honorable thing. Vitellius here betrays himself really as a coward and as someone with no courage, without the courage of his convictions, by attempting to negotiate to save himself, rather than doing what Otho did in an attempt to save others. Anyway, so Vitellius manages to negotiate. Okay, leave Rome and bring, your seals of office or whatever, and surrender yourself at this place at this time, and your life will be spared. So Vitellius is attempting to flee the city of Rome, but he is in fact captured by his own supporters, who escort him basically now under arrest back to the palace and force him back onto his throne. Basically, Vitellius is the only historical figure I can think of who actually failed to quit. At any rate, since he failed to quit, Vespasian's forces must lay siege to Rome, and they break into the city. Vitellius does have some supporters left. Evidently, there's a pretty brutal battle in the city. A large part of the city is apparently destroyed. Some tens of thousands of people are killed in the fighting. Vitellius goes into hiding. He's eventually, dragged out of his hiding hole, taken to the Gemonian Stairs, which is a place where the lowest of criminals are generally executed in Rome. And he's killed on the Gemonian Stairs, and then his corpse is thrown into the Tiber River. Not much else to say. F-. Again, absolutely one of the worst, arguably the worst Roman emperor. And the example set by Otho of someone who does have some moral fiber, being like, you know what, I'm gonna spare other people this grisly fate, and I'm just going to take the honorable way out and spare my followers. You see someone who is the exact opposite in Vitellius. Okay, so that brings us to Vespasian, who is the fourth and final emperor of the AD 69, the year of the four emperors. Vespasian is emperor from AD 69 until his death in 79. Now, Vespasian had been a successful general in the east prior to coming to power. He had put down a significant revolt in Judea. He was extremely well thought of by other commanders in the region, who all rallied around him and thought that he should be emperor and supported him. One of the interesting things about Vespasian, actually, is that there are remarkably few sources about anything much going on during his reign. I mean, he rules for 10 years, but there's really kind of like not a lot that we learn about that 10 years. I would say that in this case, considering he's taking over from after an era of absolute chaos following the death of Nero, that no news is probably good news. There are some significant things that happen during his reign. The Vespasian's family are called the Flavians, and so work begins on the Flavian Amphitheater, aka the Colosseum. Interestingly, Vespasian is also one of the first emperors who really sort of consciously is creating propaganda about himself. He's trying to create a sense of legitimacy for himself. And also probably trying to create some popularity, because the reality is that he had to tax significantly in order to sort of make the empire whole financially. So he does raise taxes. He restored a tax on public urinals, which was widely mocked, and his son Titus criticized him for doing this, and Vespasian's response was that money doesn't stink, which is a phrase that's been common ever since, so he may have created that phrase. Actually, for someone who we know very little about, he is kind of a quotable guy, as we'll see. He has maybe the best deathbed quote, one of the best in history anyway. Vespasian, one thing that's interesting about him, he's the first emperor who comes from an equestrian family rather than a senatorial family. He eventually does become a senator, but he is not born into a senatorial family. He's born into an equestrian family, the sort of like second tier of the kind of Roman caste system. A family of some means, but a pretty undistinguished family for someone to rise to such heights. He's also kind of the first like real soldier emperor, where he's someone who has made a name for himself really as a general. that is what he is known for. One story that I read somewhere about Vespasian that sort of indicates his wiliness, I guess, is, as mentioned, he had to collect a lot of taxes in order to try and set the finances of the empire right. And collecting taxes is obviously unpopular. So what Vespasian would do, apparently, is he would allow corrupt tax assessors and collectors to work and to collect huge amounts of stolen money for themselves. He would let them do this even though he knew that they were stealing, until they had accumulated significant fortunes. Then he would pretend to discover that they had been stealing all of this money. He would make a public show of executing the person, and he would then seize all the money that they had collected. Basically as a way of collecting extra tax money, but by using these people who were thieves, and then avoiding being blamed for it by having them executed for their thieving. Pretty dark, but an effective practice, and I think one that sort of marks Vespasian out as wily and clever. So there's not really a lot going on in Vespasian's reign. We don't know too much about him, but we do know what his dying words were, and they're pretty awesome. Supposedly Vespasian's last words were, "I think I'm becoming a god," which is pretty funny because, of course, Vespasian would be deified. So I will give Vespasian a B+. I don't think that there's any there are no real signature accomplishments or much that we know about him, but it seems that he had a stable reign after a period of chaos and was generally successful. So Vespasian was also the first emperor who was succeeded by his biological son, and that biological son was Titus, who reigned from AD 79 to 81. Titus served with his father in Judea. He was also a general of renown. He received a triumph for putting down the Jewish revolt in Judea, and indeed, there was an arch constructed in Rome, the Arch of Titus, which still stands to this day, and you can see it. Interestingly, Titus became a somewhat controversial figure during his father's reign. He was the Praetorian prefect. He also had an affair with the Jewish queen Berenice, which scandalized some people, and it is kind of interesting given that he was responsible for putting down and killing a lot of people in Judea. So Titus comes to power after his father's death. He's in power for only 2 years. A couple significant things happen during his reign, however. First of all, this is when Mount Vesuvius erupts and destroys the towns of Pompeii and Herculaneum. Obviously, that's not Titus's fault. However, he is widely credited with his relief efforts for the people of the region. It's also during the reign of Titus that the Colosseum first opened. Titus did some other things that sort of indicate that he had a positive character, although we should be careful about what sources say about figures who are reviled and also those who are revered. Nevertheless, Titus put an end to the treason trials that had marred many reigns up to this point, and he tried to sort of put an end to this culture of suspicion and people informing on each other and being strung up for treason just for, saying something disparaging about the emperor. He basically said, yeah, I don't care what people say because I know I'm awesome. And so he put an end to the treason trials. And I think he also said that if any of the former emperors are in fact gods, then if you speak ill of them, then surely they will revenge themselves. Another interesting little footnote from Titus's reign, there was a rebellion in the east under a guy named Terentius Maximus, who was a fake Nero. As mentioned, the myth that Nero had actually survived and would return to rule again would persist for centuries in the east. And so every now and then there were guys pretending to be Nero who would pop up. One of them was this Terentius Maximus, who his revolt was put down and he ended up fleeing to Parthia. But just an interesting note. Yeah, so after only just over 2 years in power, Titus died of fever. There's some suspicion that he may have been poisoned by his brother Domitian because supposedly he discovered that his brother was plotting against him but refused to act against Domitian. And interestingly, Titus also has notable dying words, like father, like son, which perhaps lends some credence to the theory that he was poisoned by his brother. His last words were, quote, "I have made but one mistake." And so Some people say his mistake was forgiving his brother or not punishing his brother for plotting against him. Who knows? May have died of natural causes, maybe not. Anyway, AD 81, Titus is dead. I will give him a C+. He seems like someone who has positive personality traits, good temperament. Probably would have been there's no reason why he wouldn't have been a good emperor if he had lived longer, but he just didn't really live long enough to get anything, to score any higher than a C+ in my view. Which brings us to Domitian, who ruled from AD 81 to 96. Domitian is the aforementioned younger brother of Titus, the younger son of Vespasian. Domitian held largely symbolic roles during the reigns of his father and elder brother. He was kind of a sort of solitary, cold figure. It seems that he spent a lot of his youth, like during his youth, his father and older brother were out on campaign. Domitian was always taking on a kind of tertiary role. He lived in their shadow. He was alone, separated from his father and brother for most of his youth because he was younger and he was not on campaign and not occupying the same kind of prominent roles that those two were. When Vespasian entered Rome as emperor, Titus was there at his side. The two were sort of like, father and son, whereas Domitian sort of brought up the rear. He was kind of he was given, titles. He was given sort of symbolic authority and status, but he was not really in the spotlight, was not really wielding a lot of power until he ends up becoming emperor in 81 AD. Domitian is quite a different figure from Titus, and there's, in a way, Domitian marks a break from the earlier emperors, and he's a good one to end on because Domitian is someone who has a really genuinely autocratic personality. Domitian makes absolutely no effort to pretend that he is just the first among equals, that he is just the first senator, or that the Senate is really in any way significant or in charge of anything. In fact, Domitian is pretty openly contemptuous of the Senate. At this point, Domitian marks a real break, I would say, from the Augustan style of government. Of course, we've had other emperors who did not like the Senate, but there is here, it's not a question of a deteriorating relationship or something happening that turns him against the Senate. Domitian hates the Senate from the beginning. He has no respect for them. He views them as having no role in government. He views himself as a monarch who is sort of divinely appointed. He doesn't think that he should have to share power with the Senate, and he doesn't think that he should even have to pretend that he does. So maybe this is a good point to address sort of what the Senate actually is and why Domitian didn't like them. There is sometimes too much of a tendency to be sympathetic to the Senate, as though it's some kind of democratic body that represents the voices of the people. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Senate is a bunch of aristocrats. It's more like a House of Lords than a parliament or a Congress. They're not elected. These are men who represent, either they earn their way there by being, like Vespasian, someone who is seen as being a great general who is given senatorial status, or people who acquire enormous wealth. They're not voted in. They don't represent any constituency other than themselves and their own elite class. Interestingly, I think part of the reason why Domitian instinctively hated the Senate is, as noted, Vespasian was the first emperor who did not come from a senatorial family. The family was admitted to the Senate eventually, but he was not born into a senatorial family. And so I think he has an instinctive disliking of these aristocrats who think that by virtue of their birth or their accumulated wealth, they have the right to lecture him. Of course, that's somewhat hypocritical, since the reason Domitian is emperor is because his father was and his elder brother was before him. But there's a genuine disdain that Domitian has for the Senate that he will carry through his entire reign. So as noted, Domitian really sees himself as a monarch, and interestingly, as a monarch who has a kind of responsibility for the moral quality of the people over whom he rules. So he has himself appointed perpetual censor. Censor, it's a little bit different than what we might consider a censor to be, but also sort of similar. Basically, Domitian saw himself as being responsible for the morals of his people, correcting those morals. There's an almost kind of like medieval worldview here, or like a later, like a Christian medieval king interesting view that he is somehow responsible before the gods and before posterity for the moral conduct of his people, and he seeks to control it in a rather censorious and autocratic kind of way. Really, Domitian is kind of a classic autocratic personality. He comes across as someone who doesn't sleep, who's very, very diligent. He's interested in every aspect of rulership. He's the opposite of Tiberius, where he really wants to be involved and to micromanage every single aspect of the government. He wants to centralize all authority in himself. And interestingly, this is sort of symbolized in the fact that Domitian spends a lot of time away from the city of Rome, more than almost any other emperor to this point, or maybe more than any of them. He spends years out on campaign, away from the city, and it's almost as if to make a point that the center of government, the center of power, is not the city of Rome. It's not the Senate of Rome. It is wherever he happens to be. He is the center of government. I think he really sends that message by being kind of mobile. He attempts to sort of live up to the military tradition of his family. While he's in Gaul, he launches a sort of completely unnecessary war against a minor group of barbarians called the Chatti. He gives himself a triumph for this, but he's sort of mocked and derided in the sources because it's really not a great conflict or a great victory. It's just sort of something that he does. It's a rite of passage for a Roman emperor. You need to go find some group of barbarians or enemies somewhere and defeat them so that you can prove that you are worthy of the great office to which you have acceded. Also, Domitian tries to conquer Dacia, which is modern-day Romania. So Decebalus, the king of the Dacians, and various other barbarian groups in that area had been sort of penetrating Roman territory, raiding Roman territory. This was not a war of conquest. Actually, interestingly, Domitian was personally opposed to attempting to expand the bounds of the empire. He was not an expansionist. He viewed this war as defensive, and he sought to defeat Decebalus in order to protect the Roman Empire. He was ultimately not successful in conquering Dacia, which is kind of a blot on his record, but he did try. Interestingly, Domitian was greatly increased the efficiency of the way that the government functioned because he was so diligent and so obsessive. A number of sources note that corruption was way down, efficiency was way up. Basically because imperial officials knew that Domitian, you could not get anything past Domitian. Domitian would be up until 4 a.m. reading every single brief that he could get his hands on. And so people behaved because they feared Domitian. He very strictly punished wrongdoers. He was not afraid to have people executed. He was very, very strict at enforcing the rules of the Senate. It was sort of he was looking for an excuse to humble anybody who was powerful. And he was very much a kind of an Inspector Javert type, a very much a letter of the law guy. However, he was against nepotism, and he appointed a lot of people who were he perceived as competent, even if they were not necessarily they didn't necessarily have a lot of pedigree, or if they weren't related to him. His brother and father had both been big on nepotism and appointing family members to important posts. Of course, many monarchs and emperors do the same thing because that's who is going to be more loyal to you than your own blood, right? It's viewed as the safest thing you can do. But Domitian was not in favor of nepotism, and indeed he executed a number of his relatives. He was not going to give special treatment to his own family, even to the extent of sparing them from being executed. He treated them as he would have treated anyone else. In fact, his strictness, while it greatly increased the efficiency and reduced the corruption of the government, it was probably also the cause of his downfall and death. Domitian was ultimately assassinated in a conspiracy that was led by his chamberlain and a number of other people who were personally in his service in AD 96. It seems likely that the reason they did this is because perhaps they were afraid that Domitian was going to turn on them, that he was going to imprison or execute them. certainly they wouldn't have had a hard time finding people to finance them or support them in the Senate. Domitian was loathed by the Senate. Indeed, immediately after he was killed, they convened an emergency session to pass a damnatio memoriae on Domitian, basically saying that his memory should be cast into the abyss. He should be erased from history. He's an enemy of the state, etc., etc. However, while Domitian personally seems like an unlikable guy, being someone who was really, really centralized power in himself, didn't really handle dissent very well and thought that he was and should be the ultimate arbiter of everything, a real dictatorial personality type. It's worth noting that the reign of Domitian really is a turning point, and that the view of the emperor as being really the center of power, and no longer really needing to be bound by the pretense that he is anything other than a dictator, that style of leadership really will carry forward. And also the idea of being emperor as a kind of sacred and godly trust, where the emperor is responsible for the morality, for the content of Roman society in a very dictatorial way. That idea will carry forward as well. And whether or not we like that idea, I mean, I certainly personally don't. The fact that subsequent emperors will have something more of the flavor of Domitian to them than preceding emperors is in a way a mark of the success of his reign, of his centralizing and autocratic tendencies as emperor. As I said, I'm not really going to make moral judgments, even though I find Domitian to be kind of an unlikable character. I have to concede that his reign was not glitteringly successful. He did have failures, but he was emperor for 15 years. He was relatively successful, and a lot of the sort of ideas of his reign and of his idea of what the emperor is were in fact carried forward and would inform the future. So I will give Domitian a B. And that's where we're going to end the first part of this series. I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed brushing up on my knowledge of the early Roman emperors, and I certainly look forward to rating different emperors, especially as we start to get into the crisis of the 3rd century, where there are all kinds of emperors who ruled for 6 minutes before getting murdered because they sucked, and lots of lesser known figures who were emperor. I look forward to discussing those as well next time around.